Hello and welcome to chapter 24 of this Flutter course. In the previous chapter, we talked about ensuring that the user's email is verified before he or she can proceed with the before the user is able to go to the main UI of the application. And what we are going to do now is take a step back from developing our UI and logic of the application by creating an auth service. So I'm going to provide you with a caption here. And as you can see, it says Auth Provider and Auth Service, meaning an Auth Provider abstract class and an Auth Service. Now, if we have a look at the code that we've created so far, let me bring up Visual Studio Code so you can see it on the screen like I do here. I'm going to increase the size so you see it better. And I'm going to bring up the application as well so you can see it side by side. I have three screens here, so it's a little bit difficult to juggle. Excuse me. So I'm going to change the screen layout so you see the code better. If you look here, we have our three views: login, register, and verify email view. Okay, or we actually have four views. The other one is the main UI of the application, which we have right now created in here, notes view. Excuse me. But if you have a look at the login view, you can see one of the things that we're doing immediately as we go to the login view is not actually immediately by pressing the login button. We're talking with Firebase auth, signing in. We are kind of doing the same thing, talking with Firebase by in the register view. You can see Firebase auth instance, create user. And we also have Firebase in our verify email. So you can see here, we are actually importing Firebase auth Firebase. So if you're not if you don't have a software development background from before, you may think, well, this is fine, we're importing Firebase, but you also need to know that Firebase is kind of like a low-level abstraction layer that that is talking to the Firebase backend and providing you with a lot of high-level functionality. But those high-level functionalities at the Firebase level, they're kind of high-level. But if you think about that, Firebase is a dependency that we're bringing into our application that's talking with Firebase backend, and in itself is low level compared with our UI. So if you think that the UI code is here, then what we are doing is that we're like saying, here is Firebase, and then the UI is talking directly with the Firebase libraries and functionalities. And in the eyes of a software developer who's been doing this for a while, this is not a good idea, simply because we're missing a little bit of a layer in between the UI and Firebase, which abstracts away the Firebase functionality from the UI of the application. And as we talked about it before, it is possible that in the future you may want to allow, for instance, Apple login or Google login or sign in with Facebook, etc. Various options for signing in. And if you look at the console at Firebase, you'll see immediately that you have various ways of authenticating a user. At the moment, we've enabled sign-in method for email and password, but you also have the ability to add a new provider, because as you can see, Google, Facebook. And these, as you can see, they're called providers, a new provider. And that is what we're going to do in this chapter of our Flutter course as well. So we're going to take Firebase and think of it as an authentication provider. Okay, so we're going to create a class, which I believe we're calling at the moment Firebase Auth Provider. But we're going to say that this Firebase Auth Provider comes from another class, which is called Auth Provider. So what we're going to do then is going to say, okay, any auth provider that our application can work with is expected to have certain functionalities and certain properties, okay, such as the current auth provider should be able to return the current user. The auth provider should be able to log a user in, log a user out, register a user, send an email verification. So these few basic functionalities. So that will be our abstract auth provider class. And then we will create another class, which is, as we call it, it will be the concrete implementation of that abstract class. So think of the abstract class as kind of like it is our contract. So we're saying any authentication provider such as Google, Facebook, etc., will need to conform to the functionality that we specified in this abstract class. Okay. Then we will go and develop a concrete implementation of that abstract class, and we will call it Firebase Auth Provider. And we will actually place the real implementation of our authentication for Firebase, such as creating a user, logging a user in, etc., in that concrete implementation. Okay. And then what we will do also, we will create another class, which we will call it, I believe we call it Auth Service. And its goal in this course, it won't do so much. What it will do, it will just take a provider such as a Firebase Auth Provider, a Google Auth Provider, and it will just expose the functionalities of that provider to the outside world. And the goal of this is that so we will have our UI talking with that service, and that service will talk to a provider, which is the Firebase Auth Provider, and that Firebase Auth Provider will talk to Firebase. So we're right now we have Firebase UI, but after the end of this chapter, we will have Firebase, Firebase Auth Provider, Auth Service, and then the UI. So we will have two layers sitting in between. And you may actually correctly think that, well, this is a lot of work. Why do we need that? But for me, if I wanted this course to be just another course where I show you how to include Firebase, then it wouldn't be, to be honest with you, worth actually doing yet another course about Firebase and Flutter, because there are lots of courses available. Maybe not courses that go through so much details as I am going. But I still believe that my job here is not just to make you a developer, but also make you a good developer, where you take some extra steps in order to make your code a little bit better. And this is what you will actually notice as you get more into software development and working with others inside teams, which you may not be doing at the moment. But when you get your first job as a software developer, you'll understand that other software developers are actually taking some extra steps in order to make their code a little bit easier and better to maintain. So that's what we're going to do in our code. Okay. So, that was the intro for this chapter. What we need to do is to first think about how we're handling our exceptions. If you look inside in the verify view, we're not taking care of exceptions as such. Maybe that's something we'll need to do as well. But if you look at the login screen, for instance, we're having here a try block. And then when it gets to Firebase auth exception, we're handling user not found, wrong password, and then if anything else happens, we just say show error. So here there are two specific errors, auth errors, that we're handling: wrong password and user not found. And if we go to the register view, you will also see we have weak password, email already in use, and invalid email. All right. So these are some of the exceptions that we'll need to handle in our application. But right now, as you can see, our UI is going directly to Firebase auth exception, and it's like importing Firebase auth exception, which is created inside, let's have a look, Firebase auth exception src interface. It's in one of the files, which I believe is accessible through Firebase auth. So if you go to Firebase auth, that probably imports all the exceptions as well. There we go. Here it is. So, our UI shouldn't really know anything about Firebase auth by the end of this chapter. So let's take the first step here then, and let's go and create our, as you can see, a new file under lib, under a folder called services auth, and then auth exceptions.dart. So I'm going to do that right now. Going to collapse these. Let's go under lib, and you can see that we don't have, right now we have constants, utilities, and views, so we don't have anything called services. So let me right click on lib and say new file, and you can do the same thing. And in here, just enter the entire path. So say services, auth, and then we say auth exceptions.dart. Okay. So that is our new file that we created in there. And what we need to do is to go and define all those exceptions. So let's begin by saying that we need a new exception called user not found auth exception. And if you remember, user not found is something that we're handling here. Do you remember? Firebase auth exception in the login view. And if we cannot find that user, we're just showing an error, saying show error dialog. So let's define an exception for that. I'm going to say class user not found auth exception, and I'm going to say implements exception. So this is a typical way of creating exception classes in your application, that you say, here is my own class that, for instance, represents an exception, and it's good practice just to say that it implements an existing exception. You can see here by command pressing on it, you can see it goes to Flutter, bin, cache, core, exceptions, Dart. So it is already imported by default. You don't have to import any specific file in order to get access to the exception class. So it suffices that you just implement that class. Okay. So now let's go ahead and implement the next exception. As the title, as the caption says here, wrong password auth exception, and that is also handled inside our login view. Wrong password right here. So I'm just gonna go and kind of like copy that code, and in here I'm just gonna say wrong password auth exception. All right, what else are we handling here? Nothing else in the login view, at least. So that's really good. So I'm just gonna close the login view for now and save this file. Okay. So let's now start taking care of some of the exceptions that we're handling in our register view. And let's go to register view, and you'll see here that the first exception that we're handling is called weak password. So I'm gonna put a comment in here and a comment in here. I'm gonna say login exceptions and register exceptions. Okay. So as the caption says, let's create a class called weak password auth exception. I'm going to copy this code from here, and I'm going to say weak password auth exception. Okay. So that's for the register views weak password. The next one is email already in use. So that's what the caption says here as well. So let's go and copy this, and I'm going to say email already in use auth exception. Okay. So now we have weak password and email already in use exceptions. And let's have a look. And we also have the invalid email auth exception, which I don't think I had planned for, but let's go and implement that as well. So let's say invalid email auth exception. Okay. Okay. Now, what we also need to do is to define a few other exceptions. As you remember from register view, we also have the case of an else, where we basically say something else happened here is an auth exception, but something else may have happened that we haven't handled with its code. Or we may also have another catch statement here that catches like generic exceptions. And we're doing the same thing, as you can see the code here. Let me change the screen layout so you see it better. I'm going to go to the login view as well, because we're doing the exact same thing in the login view, in that upon getting a Firebase auth exception, this code, then we also have an else statement even in there. So we're saying if the code is not like handled by us, it may be another code. In that case, also show the show error dialog, or in that case, show error dialog. And we're also doing a catch, like a generic catch as well. So we need kind of like an exception that handles all those cases. So an unknown code during the Firebase auth exception and an unknown exception. So we're going to create a generic exception. All right. Going to change the screen layout a little bit. Like that. I'm going to go to my notes. Okay. So let's just in here say generic exceptions. And I'm going to bring this one up as well. Actually, I'm going to bring this one first. So let's go ahead and create a generic auth exception. I'm going to copy this code from here. I'm going to say generic auth exception. Okay. And what we also need to do is to provide this thing, user not logged in auth exception. And you will know now that you will need to know why we're actually having a user not logged in auth exception. And this will be an exception that our that our Firebase provider will be able to throw if the user is null after registering that user, for instance. So let's say that we tell our auth provider, we say register a user with this email and password, and no exception happens, nothing. So the application thinks that, all right, everything went as expected. But what if the user that we access at Firebase auth is null? In that case, our auth provider should be able to handle that and send an exception saying that, oh, I couldn't find this user, or this user isn't logged in. So let's create that exception as well. So I'm just going to say user not logged in exception. So let's just say class implement exception. Okay, so user not logged in auth exception, and I'm going to save that as well. All right, that was a lot of work. Now we have created all those files. Oh, sorry, maybe you didn't actually see the code that I wrote. I don't like having captions up all the time, but I also think captions are so important so that you always know what we're working with. But the downside of having these captions at the bottom left of the screen is that sometimes they hide what I'm typing. So I'm doing my best really to catch those catch that issue, and if I see that happening, I'm gonna bring the screen up like this so you see it, but sometimes I may be missing that, and I apologize for that. So let's say that, and now we've implemented all our exceptions, and as you can see in the captions, it says we need an auth user, we shouldn't expose Firebase's user to the UI. And this, to be honest with you, is the same story as we had for our exceptions. The UI code should not at all be working with Firebase. The UI code should be so high level and so abstracted from the rest of your application that it shouldn't even at all know how it is functioning. You're just giving it different providers and services, and it should be calling those services and providers, not really knowing how they're tied together. And at the moment, you can see our login view. It's like let's go in here. You can see here in login view, and for me, it's on line 67. For you, maybe in a different line. But we're after calling the sign in with email and password function, which we also shouldn't be doing. But what we're doing after that is we're getting the current user from Firebase, and this user is of type. You can see, let's go in here and see it. It's of type user. So if I go put the type in here and command click on it, you see this user is part of Firebase auth. You see, there's a class called user. So we're also like exposing a Firebase user to our UI, and that is not a good idea. So as the caption says here, we shouldn't expose Firebase's user to the UI. So we need to have our own user that abstracts away the functionality or that the current user at Firebase level has. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to create an auth user Dart file in lib services auth, a file called auth user. So I'm going to I'm going to close all the files that I've created, and under services auth, I'm going to then create an auth user. So I'm going to say auth user.dart. And in this auth user, then we need to basically start working with Firebase in this case. So I'm going to go to my notes just to ensure I'm telling you everything that I plan to tell you. All right, so let's go in here and import Firebase, its user, import package Firebase, and is it in Firebase auth, I believe, and then we're going to say show user. Okay, and as I've mentioned before, this is a great way of just ensuring that you're not exposing too much of a package's classes to your current workspace, except what you're saying is that Firebase auth maybe an entire Dart file with its structures, maybe thousands of classes. Now I'm exaggerating, but a lot of classes, but you're only interested in the user class. Okay, so you could also like say as Firebase auth like that, and then you would say show user, and that will allow you. So if I say test, then you will be able to say Firebase auth.user. You could also do that if you prefer to, for instance, prefix the user, in this case that comes from Firebase, with the actual place that it comes from. You could also use as. Some people may like it. I also do, but I haven't planned to do that in this particular file. So do it if you want to, the way that I'm doing it here, so you can follow along with the steps that I'm providing for you in this course without diverging from the point. Okay, now that we've done the import, what we need to do, as the caption indicates, we need to create the actual class. So let's say class auth user. And in here, what we need is a field called is email verified. Now, remember, right now, all we need from our auth user is to know whether that email is verified or not. So if you go, for instance, to our login view, you can see that we have this code here. That signs a user in with email and password, and right after that gets the user, and all it does with that user is says email verified. And we're doing the same thing in register view, I believe. So let's go to register view, and you can see in here, and it says, actually there we're not doing anything with the email verified. All we're doing is just saying a send email verification. So sorry about that. So it's in login screen, okay? So let's go in our auth user in here and say it has a property called is email verified. Okay, so I'm gonna say final, bool is email. And you saw that Firebase has implemented this property as email verified. I personally prefer to call Boolean functions, Boolean getters, in this case, like a property of a class, with is wherever I see that fit. It's just because it makes a lot more sense for me, at least, to say user.isEmail verified rather than saying user.email verified. It just makes it more like complete grammatically, is blah blah verified or is da 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 da. So that's the reason that we're diverging a little bit. Okay, now you see this in here, and we're saying is email verified. You can get help from Visual Studio Code to create a constructor for final fields. And even if you don't want to do that, you could always just type it by hand. You can say auth user self is email verified. Sorry, this is email verified. And since this class, it only has a property that you can set upon initialization and you're not changing it because it's a final field, excuse me, you can make your constructor a const. Excuse me again. And it would also be good if you could basically, let's say, immutable as another try defining, undefined. I believe you actually have to import foundation in here. Now, immutable basically is what immutable here, I don't think we've talked about that before, but it's just like an annotation telling that this class and any subclasses of this class are going to be immutable, meaning that their internals are never going to be changed upon initialization. So if you then go and create, for instance, class my auth user and say extends the auth user, and then you'll have a bool, let's say in here, and you create a constructor for it. So let's create a constructor for it. So boom, okay. Prefer declaring, what does it say, const? Okay, then we say const. Then you say, okay, well, I want a Boolean flag in here. Bool is blah, and yeah, bool is blah. Now you see it says non-nullable instance flag, but it must be initialized. Let's just initialize it to false. And it says can't define a const constructor. Okay, then we're not going to make it a const constructor. And now you see that little warning here. It says this class, or a class that this class inherits from, is marked as immutable, but one or more of its instance fields aren't final. So now you see what immutable means. It tells Dart that this class and all its subclasses need to be immutable. They cannot have any fields that change. So by removing this field, then you get rid of that little warning, and you can make this const, and the error completely goes away. So now you know what immutable means, okay? All right, great. Now we created that is email verified and a const constructor for our auth user. Let's go to the next point. The next point, as you can see here, it says we need a factory constructor that creates our auth user from a Firebase user. And factory constructors are really useful for this purpose in that you have, let's say, object X, and you want to create an object Y from that. instead of you manually gluing things in some sort of a middle layer, saying that, oh, I take the object X and add some blah blah and fuse it together and then put object Y, you can put that responsibility on object Y and saying that you need to be able to initialize yourself or construct an instance of yourself from this object. And this is like a typical pattern that you'll see everywhere. So well, everywhere, but where you have the ability to do that. So that's what we're gonna do now with a factory constructor. So let's say we have a factory constructor here, and we say auth user, and we say from Firebase, okay, as the caption says. Then we take a Firebase user in here, like that. And then we say what we will do in here, we will actually create an instance of our own class, an auth user, given that user. Okay, so let's say then we create an auth user in here, an auth user, and its email verified comes from user email verified, like that. All right. So this shouldn't be that difficult to understand. So this goes into this constructor, you can see, and it takes the email verified value of the Firebase user and places it in this class. So all we did is just we kind of like copied a Firebase user and we made a copy of it into our own auth user. Okay, so we're not exposing Firebase's user and all of its properties to our user interface. All right, that was a lot of information. Now let's talk about an auth provider. As I mentioned in the beginning of this chapter, um, as you saw in the Firebase console, you will have the possibility to add various auth providers to your application when you're working with Firebase, so such as Google, Apple, Facebook, and many, many more. Okay, an email and password combination like we're doing. So all of those are providers. What we need to do now is to create an auth provider class that encapsulates every provider that we may add in the future and creates a nice interface for them. So every provider that our application can work with should conform to this particular interface. Okay, so let's go ahead and take care of that now. And I can see here we're going to create that file under lib services auth provider. So we have lib services auth, but we don't have auth provider file. So let's right click on auth and say auth provider dart. I'm going to go to my notes. So what we're going to do in here then is, since our auth provider is going to work with our it's, for instance, the functions that we're going to provide for our auth provider are, for instance, a getter that gets the current user. So that's not a function, it's just a getter, the way we're actually doing it in here. If you see, let me go to login view, and you'll see in login view here, this thing at the moment is saying Firebase auth instance current user. This is a getter, so this is a property and returns the Firebase user. What we want is for our auth provider to also be able to provide us with the current user. Now remember, we've abstracted away the Firebase user with our own auth user, which we just created. Okay, so what we need is this abstract class that can return an instance of our auth user. Okay, so for that, we need to import this auth user into this Dart file. So let's just say import package. This application that I've created, as you can see in the title, is called My Notes. So let's go to My Notes, services, auth, and then auth user. So that's the import statement. As you can see in the caption, I've written package XXX, and that's where you need to put the name of your package. In this case, for me, is My Notes. All right, that's great. Now let's go create an abstract class. So I've mentioned this twice before, but our auth provider Dart file is not going to have any logic. It's an abstract class, though abstract classes in Dart can contain logic, but in this case, our abstract class is just going to be a protocol, or you may know it as interface, or you may also know it as well an abstract class. So let's go ahead and create that. Let's say abstract class auth provider. And so the abstract class creation is done. what we need to do is now give it like the ability to return the current auth user. Okay, so as the caption says, we're going to say auth user and get current user. Okay, so we're saying any auth provider, whether it works with email password, whether it's a Google auth provider, whether it's an Apple, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, it needs to be able to optionally return the currently authenticated user, and that's what this optional sign is here for. Okay. And then what we will also need to do is to allow it to be able to log a user in. Okay, so we're going to say we will have a function that completes in the future and returns an auth user, and it says log in like this. Okay. And now we have to think, what does this login actually require? Well, in our case, it requires email and password. So let's just put email and password. We're thinking that every auth provider that we're writing is going to have an email and password combination of some sort. You could say ID and password, but I'm just going to go with email and password for now. Okay. So let's make these required parameters as well. So I'm going to put curly brackets here and curly bracket here. I'm going to say required string email and then a required string password like this. Okay, and a semicolon at the end of that. Command S to save the file so Dart formatter can do its magic. And the reason that you see, if we go to if we go to our login screen again, and in here, we say sign in with user and password. You can see that it always returns a user credential. Now you may think, how can it always return a user credential if the current email and password are actually incorrect and they don't belong to a valid user? Well, the way that Firebase is handling is that if you say sign in with email and password, if it can grab the current user, if it can sign in that user with the information that you provide, it returns it. Otherwise, it fails with an exception, meaning that is saying that as long as you call me and there's no exception, I will give you a user credential. If there's an exception, well, you need to handle that. So that is a great way to avoid having functions. Let me close the auth user as well. Avoid having functions that do like this, that optionally return a user. So do your work in your functions, return the object that you promised. If you can't do that, throw an error, so you don't have to do this kind of a optional return. Okay. For the login function, now we need to also have a function that can create a user. So that, imagine that is for the sign up, or what else do we call it? Register. Yeah. So let's call it a create user. So we say this also returns a auth user, and we call it create user like this. And this also has all these parameters. So I'm just going to copy and paste these so you don't have to do that twice. And a semicolon at the end. All right, Dart formatter, do its thing. And then let's go and create a function that allows us then to log a user out, because that's what we're doing in the main UI of the application. Okay. The log out, it's not going to return any value. As you can see in the caption here, just a future void. So we say future void log out, just like that. All right. So that was simple. Also, we will need a function that can send an email verification. Okay, so this one's also very easy. It's just a future void. And as I can see in the captions, we're calling it send email verification. All right. So how was that? Okay. As I mentioned, our auth provider at the moment is just an abstract class. So it's dictating an interface for any authentication provider that we're going to add to our application. But just so you know, we are only going to add an email auth provider, okay? Or, a Firebase auth provider. But this way, by creating an abstract class with an auth provider as a name, and then you creating a concrete class called Firebase auth provider, you're able to, in the future, to extend this and add more and more auth providers, all of which will follow the same interface, okay? So that's the goal. But we're only in this course are going to use Firebase auth provider. So just so you know, as the caption says, go ahead and create a file called Firebase auth provider in your services auth folder. Going to right click here, and I'm going to say, oops, and say new file. I'm going to call it Firebase Auth Provider .dart. Now let's go in here and say, I'm going to go to my notes a little bit here, like that. Okay, so this is going to be like the juiciest part of this chapter. We are actually going to abstract away Firebase authentication into our own provider. So expect this file to grow a little bit in size. I can see in my notes it's going to go to about 100 lines of code, but that's okay too. So, and we can just get started with it. So as you can see in the caption, we need to import a few files. Auth user, auth provider, and auth exceptions. We need auth user because this, actually, let me first explain why we need to import auth provider, because our Firebase auth provider is going to be a concrete implementation of the file auth provider or the class auth provider that we just created. So that's the reason for that import. The auth user import is going to be because, as you can see in the auth provider, the login and create user functions, they need to return an auth user. So that's why we need to import auth user so that our provider can return instances of that, okay? And last but not least, we also need to import auth exceptions because remember, our Firebase auth provider is also going to abstract away all the authentication errors and exceptions that otherwise happen at the Firebase level into our own exceptions that we've created here, auth exceptions, okay? So let me go ahead and first import auth user. So package, this application called My Notes, and we have services auth, and then we have auth user. Okay, so I'm gonna import that, and I'm gonna copy this file then, this line. The next one is gonna be the auth provider, and as you can see in the captions, we also have to import auth exceptions. Okay, so those are the 3 imports. Now, since we have our own imports, and this file is going to talk directly with Firebase, we also need to import Firebase, of course. So let's go and import. I'm going to actually copy that code so I don't have to type all of it because it's a little bit boring, but you can see in the captions at least what you need to import: the Firebase auth, and you need to also import Firebase auth exception. Okay, great. So that's our imports. Now what we need to do is to create the actual class. And as you can see, it's going to be called Firebase Auth Provider and it implements Auth Provider, which is our own class. So let's say Firebase Auth Provider implements Auth Provider just like that. Okay, and now you can see you get an error saying missing concrete implementation. I'm going to change the layout of the screen so you see the code in its entirety. And then what we need to do is to implement, you see, those functions and getters that auth provider abstract class says that every class that implements it needs to implement those things as well. So you may try to do those things by hand, but I absolutely, I'm not at all a fan of doing things by hand. Sorry about that. So I prefer to get help from the editor to complete these things. So I'm just going to say command dot and make class Firebase auth abstract create 5 missing overrides. Okay, so there we go. So Visual Studio Code created all those functions in here, and you can see in all of them it just says throw unimplemented error. Great stuff. Gonna decrease the size of the font here, go back to the same layout that we had before. So the first thing that we need to do in here, let's go ahead and implement this current user. Okay, so this is going to have a lot of, not a lot, but it's going to have a bit of logic. So I'm going to do this instead of doing with a pointer. And let's go ahead in here and try to get that user. So let's say, you see, our job is now to get the Firebase user and turn it into an auth user. Remember, our auth user had a factory constructor, so we need to call that factory constructor. Okay, so let's just say final user is equal to Firebase auth, Firebase auth instance, and then we say current user, and then we say if user is not null, and we need to create an instance of it as auth user. So we just say return auth user from Firebase user. Okay. Otherwise, we return null like this. So If Firebase says that there's a user, then we create an auth user out of that and we just return it. Okay, that was for a current user. It wasn't so much of a code, to be honest with you. Now what we need to do is to take care of create user, which is this function right here. So create user is going to be a little bit thicker, to be honest. So let's go ahead and first do a little bit of formatting in here. So I like to always append a comma at the end of the last parameter of my function so that when I do Dart formatter or Dart format, it's gonna break all these parameters into their own lines, okay? Because before it looked like this and it's not so clean in my eyes, at least. It's a preference thing, okay? So in here, what we need to do is to create basically a user with Firebase. So I'm going to put this entire thing in a try block, and then we're going to catch Firebase auth exception. On Firebase auth exception, catch E. Okay. So just like that. And then we're going to have a generic catch block in here, like this. All right. Now, what we need to do in create user in the try statement, we need to actually tell Firebase that we want to create a new user. So let's say Firebase auth instance, and then we say create user with email and password. Okay, so we have the email here and the password, and we can see those parameters are already there, so we don't have to do anything. So, but what we need to do here is you can first actually see, yeah, this function needs to return a value. We're going to fix that soon. Don't worry about that. But we also need to await on this because remember, creating a user with email and password is not a function that just returns immediately. And this is one of the things that is absolutely beautiful about Dart in that in the interface, we didn't actually say that this function has to be async, but you can, in its concrete implementation, make this function async. So it's absolutely beautiful. So async is not the part of the signature of the function, but it has more to do with the internals of that function. So in order to call this function with an await, you see, if we put await here, we get an error. We need to make this function async. All right, so great stuff. All right, so after doing that, what we're gonna do is to get the current user. If the current user is there, then we're just gonna return the current user. If the current user, after creating a user with email and password and no exceptions, is not there, then that is a bad sign. And we need to return then one of our auth exceptions called user not logged in auth exception, okay? So I'm gonna close this. So let's go in here and say final user is get, or just user is the current user. Remember, we already have a getter for a current user right here, okay? And it just gets the current user from Firebase. So we say, here's the user. If the user is available there, is not null, then just return the user. Otherwise, you should throw a user not found, or I think that's what we call the user not logged in auth exception. All right. So that's for the creation of the user if everything goes fine except for this part. Now we need to go to our Firebase auth exception and we need to handle a few things. So if you look at where in our register view, in here, we are handling weak password, email already in use, and invalid email. So let's just copy these three things, okay? Actually, these four things because we have an else block in there as well, okay? So I'm gonna copy that code. Just do the same thing, please. So go to your registry and copy that code. Go back to your Firebase Auth Provider. Inside the Firebase Auth exception where you're catching that, paste that code, but remove everything that has anything to do with the show error dialog. Okay, so at least we have the if and else statements, okay, like this. So you should end up with a code that looks like this. Now, where there is a weak password, we're actually going to throw our own error. So we're going to say throw weak password auth exception. In case of email already in use, we're going to throw email already in use auth exception. In case of an invalid email, throw invalid email auth exception. And if there is any other code that we don't know about, we're just going to throw a generic auth exception. Okay? And also, if there is a final catch, basically meaning that by calling the create user and email with email and password, if there's any other exception other than Firebase auth exception, we also need to handle that and throw a generic auth exception there as well. Okay, a lot of code, but hopefully this makes our UI code easier to read. Okay, so we're doing this for a good purpose. Great stuff. That's for our create user. I'm going to fold create user if it allows me to fold the entire create user. Poof. And I'm going to fold current user as well. So this is a technique that you can, or not a technique, this is just a trick you can do in your editor if it supports folding and unfolding, just to make sure that it looks a little bit cleaner, okay? Because now that you've written create user, you may not be directly interested in all its details. You may just want to know that it's there, okay? All right, the next thing we need to do is to implement send email verification. So let's find that function, and I can see it's right here, send email verification. I'm going to scroll a little bit up so you see like that. Going to go to my notes as well. Okay, so what we need to do then is to in send email verification, what we need is to also mark this as async because it's going to call an asynchronous function on Firebase as well. Okay. And we need to call the send email verification function on the Firebase user. Remember, our user doesn't have that functionality. Our user only has is email verified property. So in here, let's get the Firebase user. So I'm going to say user is Firebase auth instance current user. And we say if user is not null, then we call that function. So we say await user send email verification. I remember, I think this was a feature of void, so that's why we're doing await on it, and that is why we have the async tag in here. Okay, now if the user is nil, then we're gonna just say user is not logged in. You cannot send an email verification from a user who's not logged in. Okay, so then you throw user not logged in auth exception. Okay. So that's our send email verification function. Let's then fold this function as well so we don't see its internals. As the caption says, now we need to go and implement login. Login is just as important as creating a user. I'm going to start by putting a comma at the end of password parameter here and Command S in order to save it. And in here, in the login function, we're going to do something very similar to what we were doing in the register function. I can see in my notes. By doing a try, and then we say on Firebase auth exception catch e, and then we say catch any other exception. Okay, so let's in here then start by telling Firebase that we want to log in with those credentials. So let's say Firebase auth instance, and then we say sign in with email and password. So there's a function in there. Okay, and I'm gonna put a semicolon at the end so you can see the code. All right, so that's what we're doing. But remember, again, these functions are asynchronous. So you can't just call that function and expect it to work. It's a feature of user credential, okay? So make your function asynchronous and then await on this function. So we're going to do something very similar to what we're doing in register, sorry, in the create user, in that we're saying final user is current user. I hope you can see that code. Yes, I can see that you can see. So in this code, we're gonna take the exact same code that we wrote in create user. So I'm gonna expand that. You can see here. Poof. I'm gonna copy that code, and you could do the same. What we're doing is just making sure after signing in, then there is a current user. Okay, copy that code. Gonna fold this. Then I'm gonna bring it to the login. And right after sign in with email and password, I'm going to paste that code. Okay, so that's that part. Now, you see, now we have Firebase auth exception again to handle, just like we did with create. So let's go to your login view and have a look at which exceptions we were handling. So I can see here we're handling these. I'm actually going to copy that entire code from login view. You see a Firebase auth exception, user not found, wrong password, etc., and including the catch any other exception block right here. Copy that code and bring it to your Firebase Auth Provider and replace, let me actually see how it looks like. Yeah, replace all of this with that, okay? And then remove your awaits as we did before. To be honest with you, this is just a lot of big talk for saying that we um, need some code from another place to bring here. So your code now should look like this. So it says on Firebase auth exception, and we're handling user not found, wrong password auth exceptions from Firebase, and a generic catch block. Okay. So in the case of a user not found Firebase auth exception, we're going to say throw user not found auth exception. In the case of a wrong password, we're going to say throw wrong password auth exception. And any other case that might occur here, we're just going to throw generic auth exception. Okay? And in here as well, we're going to say throw generic auth exception. And one thing I really like to do is, you see, in Dart, it's not yet possible to say that I want to ignore a variable. In this case, you can see that in this, like where we have a catch, we actually have to pattern match against an exception, and then we have to assign a name to it. And that name is called E inside this function. So if I type E, you can see it's an object. However, as you can see in the body of this function, we're not actually interested in E at all. We're not using it. So in other languages, it is possible to ignore, like in JavaScript, Python, Swift, Rust, it is possible to ignore a variable and saying that, hey, I'm not interested in this value, by putting something called like an underscore or something. You can do the same thing in Dart. The difference is that in Dart, if you say underscore, you're not actually ignoring it. That variable is also there, but it's just called underscore in this case. So you can see you can still call to a string on it. So you may want to do it, or you may just want to leave it alone, because you can see Dart Analyzer, it doesn't give you an error of any kind saying that, yeah, you're pattern matching, but you're not using it. So it's up to you how you want to do it. And I like to do it like this. Wow, that was a lot of code, or maybe more like a lot of explanation. So let's go to login and fold that. And as you can see in the caption, now we have to take care of the logout function. And the caption also says that this function needs to be asynchronous, okay? And you know why? Because we're going to call a function on Firebase in order to take care of the logout. So in order for a user to be logged out, the user should actually exist. So let's just say final user is Firebase auth instance, and then we're going to say current user, and we say if user is not null, and we say user sign logout. What's it called? Or what's it called? Oh, we have to tell Firebase auth. So then we say Firebase auth instance sign out, await on it. Okay. Otherwise, we say throw user not logged in. So we're basically saying here that you cannot log out a user if that user doesn't exist, okay? Or that user isn't logged in. All right. Lots of code, lots of description, but that's okay. We've now implemented an auth provider, Firebase auth provider, okay? Which is a concrete implementation of auth provider. Now, as the caption indicates here, we need an auth service. Now, what is an auth service? I mentioned this a little bit before, but an auth service is also going to implement auth provider. And in itself is going to take an instance of an auth provider as well. But as you'll see in this chapter and in the rest of this course, you'll see that our auth service is really just the provider itself, which is exposing all the functionalities of the provider that we give it. And it has absolutely no other logic at the moment, okay? But the reason we're doing that is for me to show you that you need to have providers, and then you need to have services that they talk to each other, and then this service can then expose more value to your user interface, to your UI code, than the provider does. That's usually the case, that the service fuses together a few other providers, talk to a few providers, and at the end, it grabs the data, fuses it together, and provides that information to the UI. Now, in our case, that's not going to be the case, okay? Our Firebase, our auth service is only going to talk with our the given auth provider and expose all its functionalities to the UI. But we're doing this exercise so that you see how you can abstract away various bits and pieces of functionality from the UI code. So remember that. That's the reason we have our auth service, which we're going to soon create. Okay. So as a caption indicates here, let's go ahead and create our auth service inside the auth folder here. So auth, and I'm going to create a new file here. I'm just going to call it auth service. In this Dart file, then we need to start creating our auth service. Okay. Sorry, going to go to my notes in here as well. So what we need in here is to import a few things. We need to import our auth provider and an auth user. So I'm not going to explain this again. So package, my notes, we have services auth, and we need to import auth provider. I'm going to copy this line of code, and then I'm going to say auth user, I believe. So, so let's have a look in here in the captions, like that. Okay, so we need to create now, as you can see, we need to create an auth service that also implements auth provider. Okay, so if I look at the captions here, why is auth service and auth provider? I've already explained this to you, but you can see it says but can have more logic. So that's the reason. Okay, so don't forget that. So let's go and create a class of auth service in here. And it implements the auth provider abstract class. Okay. Now, what you'll need to do, you need to know is that the auth service in itself isn't going to be hard coded to use the Firebase auth provider. What it's going to do is that it's going to actually take an auth provider from you and saying that, okay, I will then expose the functionalities from that auth provider to the outside world with the ability to maybe even change that data before it returns it to you. But in our chapter and in the rest of this course, it's not going to do that. It's just going to expose the same auth provider's functionality to the outside world. So let's go ahead and, as the caption says, say we take an auth provider and we just call it provider. Okay. What we need to do then is to create a constructor for your auth service in here. So command dot on Mac or control dot Windows and Linux and say create constructor for final fields and make it constant as well. Okay. So now we have this beautiful little auth service that takes a provider. But as you can see, it says missing concrete implementations. And that's because we said our auth service is also an auth provider. So we have to implement those auth provider classes overrides as well. So let's add them in here as well. But this time it's going to be a lot easier to implement these functions because our auth service internally has a provider, and all it has to do is just to expose the functionalities of the provider in its own implementation. All right. So as the caption also says, we need to delegate then to our actual provider. Before we do that, I'm going to do a little bit of a cleanup here, and I suggest that you do too. In places that we have more than one parameter, let's go and put a comma at the end of the last parameter, like here and there. Boom. And that was it. I'm going to do Command S so that Dart formatter formats the code a little bit better. And let's just go ahead and expose the functionalities of our provider in our concrete implementations of the auth provider. So in here, we say provider dot create user, email and password. Perfect. For the current user, we return the provider's current user. We say provider dot current user. For the login, we then expose the provider's login function. We say provider login with that information. And for our logout, we do the same thing. So I'm going to say provider logout. Okay. And for send email notification, last but not least, so we say provider send email, provider send email notification. Great stuff. That went really fast, as you can see. Okay. Now, you see, we've done a lot of code now. If we go to our, if I change the screen layout a little bit better, a little bit so you see the code better, and let's go to our terminal, the built-in terminal. I absolutely love it in Visual Studio Code that there is an integrated terminal. And let's have a look at our Git status. You'll see that we have changed login view, but also there is an entirely new folder here called lib services. So if you then add all of that and do Git status, you'll see that we actually have done a lot of work. So uh, if I increase the size, you see we've added auth exceptions, auth provider, auth service, auth user, and Firebase auth provider, plus the changes in the login view. Now, actually, I don't know. What did we change in login view? So that's interesting to know. If you go to the login view, did we change anything in login view? Because at the moment, I can't really remember if we changed anything special in the login view. So it would be interesting to actually see what we've done. So if I go to my terminal here, and if I issue this command, as you can see here, I'm going to remove that login view from the staging environment. So like this, paste it there. And I'm going to say git status. And then I'm going to say git diff. I can see, okay, the difference is that I have added Firebase core in here, which I don't see in the login view. And also, what's changed? Has this navigator been removed? There's a lot of code in here that may have not been committed from the previous chapter. That may be it. So that may be the reason, okay? But that's all right as well. So now I'm going to say git add all. And let's then go to the next stage. As you can see, we've done a lot of work. Let's just make sure everything is committed this time, okay? So git status, everything is added to the staging environment. Then I'm just going to say git commit message and step 8 this time. And I'm going to push all those changes and get status. I can see everything's committed. Great. Also, let's tag our code, because I believe the previous chapter, we didn't tag anything, but the one before that we tagged as step 7. And that was chapter number 22, where we talked about error handling in the registry view and going to the next screen after registration. So we didn't tag anything in the previous chapter. So now we're going to tag things as step 8. So let's just say git tag step 8. I can spell here, and git push tags as well. If you then say git log, you will see git step 8 is there, step 7, every step is there, and the initial commit is there as well, which is step 1. And if you say git tag, you'll see all your tags available as well. Okay, so we've committed and tagged. We've done a lot of work in this chapter, and I don't think we need to actually drag it on for longer, because yeah, it will be unbearable maybe if it's too long. Now, as we usually do, which is the tradition here, before going to the next chapter, we prepare ourselves for what is coming. As you can see in the caches, that we need to migrate our existing code to using our own auth service. We have an auth service, which abstracts away the provider, and we have a Firebase auth provider, but we still are not using that code. So that's exactly what we're going to do in the next chapter. And if I look a little bit in my notes, I can actually see the next chapter will also be quite a long one, maybe not as long as this chapter. So maybe you'll need a cup of coffee or tea. So let's do that. And without further ado, I'll see you in the next chapter.